I'm currently a sophomore student studying computer science. Recently, I was really interested with security and specifically cybersecurity and biosecurity events. And so today, I'm going to present two different ways to basically analyze and evaluate different types of security threats using a two-dimensional matrix. So, the outline of the presentation, I'm basically going to lay out the different types of security events, which are biosecurity, cybersecurity, 9/11 type attacks, and nuclear warfare. And then I'm going to present the two different matrices that I've been working on to basically classify and categorize different security events. And then we're gonna see basically go more into detail on the economic and psychological effects of each of these security events, and then go further into seeing how we can use these matrices to help in policy and decision making regarding security. So the threat of a terror attack has never been higher in history, and this was written in an article just written last year, because we see the rise of like ISIS, different terror organizations, but also biosecurity is becoming a very significant issue because it's very easy to obtain viruses and bacteria that can be spread easily over very wide populations. And so this brings an interesting problem, which is that we need to find ways to evaluate these security events. So the different classes of security events I already went over were, specifically I was very interested in bioterrorism, including things like anthrax, Ebola, smallpox, and then reintroducing these viruses into large populations, which would cause loss of damage. 9/11 type attack, and these are from terror organizations, ISIL, Al-Qaeda, other groups around the world. Cyber war, which I think is an increasingly important problem with different countries trying to leak information into the U.S. government, but also things like a grid lockdown, where entire portions of a country or even entire portions of a city can lose electricity and lose power, and this causes a lot of damage, both to infrastructure and also psychological damage. And then, as a bit of an extreme, we have to also consider nuclear war as tension between different countries rises. So basically, I'm presenting a threat matrix, and each of these threat matrices are based on 4 quadrants, and these 4 quadrants have qualitative classifications, which are based on quantitative scores, which I've gathered data and calculated on. And specifically, the 2 matrices I'm going to be focusing on today are ease of attainment and mass casualties. And the second matrix is economic damage, economic cost versus psychological damage of a terror event. And so basically the idea is that if we can map a very wide set of security threats to a 2-dimensional graph, then it can be very easy to visualize and compare basically 2 different events. And it doesn't exist, so currently, I think it's a very useful visual tool. So here we have casualties versus accessibility, and on the x-axis we have ease of obtainment, and on the y-axis we have potential casualties. Specifically, what we can see is that we have 4 quadrants, and in quadrant 1 we see there is going to be it's easier to obtain, and its cost is higher than quadrant 4. Quadrant 2, it's harder to obtain, but the mass casualties are pretty high. So if we see, for instance, nuclear warfare, it's in the top right corner, which means that it's the hardest to obtain, but also it will provide the highest mass casualties. So it'll be the most devastating. Similarly, it's easiest to obtain guns, but its mass casualties in comparison to the rest of these events is much less. I think what I would want to focus on is the cyber security event here, it's a pretty wide oval. And so basically this means that there's actually not enough data to basically pinpoint an exact location on the quadrant, because cybersecurity events range in size. And so basically you can see that actually there are some events, like for instance hacking into a server and getting information on different companies, where they lose vital information, so they lose all their information. And then potentially, if those are very high class companies, hackers can use that information to actually cause more threat. And that would actually be a low ease of obtainment, or it's pretty easy to do that, but also has a pretty high cost in terms of casualties. So this is just one threat matrix that analyzes both casualties and accessibility. And I've drawn this line here is basically saying that there's an upward trend if we look at the different terror threats. And a lot of these are actually biosecurity events. And another current threat matrix I'm working on is cost and psychological. Actually, this is the one I'm working on this quarter, which is by the end I'm gonna try and transform this into something like this. But basically, we have 4 quadrants in this matrix, and we have them dangerous, devastating, least harmful, and scarring. By dangerous, I mean that it has a low psychological damage, but a high economic cost. So cyber warfare, the economic cost to a company or an entire organization, multiple organizations, would be very high, and so cyber warfare actually occupies that space primarily. And again, we see that nuclear warfare is in the upper right corner, which means that it has a very high psychological damage, but also a very high economic cost regarding infrastructure and casualties and hospitalizations, including all these things. We can basically determine where in this graph we can place each of these events. And as of currently, I've analyzed 5 different events: so cyber war, anthrax, Ebola, a 9/11 type attack, and nuclear. And I'm going to break it down as how I gathered the data and how I basically constructed a graph like this. So for the economic considerations, I wanted to provide a lower bound for the economic loss. And so basically the economic loss could only be higher. And we gathered data from the NIH, WHO, and World Bank, as well as the Census Bureau for the cost regarding each of these types of events. And then from the different resources, I got different numbers across the board, and this allowed me to create a min and max estimate for dealing with cost of terror. And this is called this is a typical scheme in economic analysis. So here's the data that I've accumulated for economic loss, and so basically on the different websites like NIH, WHO, for Ebola, I aggregated all the different expenditures like hospitalization, the cost per patient, how many deaths there were, the cost it was for resources, and all these statistics are actually available on all the websites and on news websites. So I've looked through those, and then basically I calculated I added them up and aggregated it. But to scale over so that's comparable between Ebola, anthrax, 9/11 type attack, cybersecurity, and nuclear, because the amount of people affected is always different. So I scaled it to 100,000 so that now we can compare the cost over each of these types of attacks. And over here, you can actually see like some of the statistics that I was analyzing. Like in the case of Ebola, there was a combined GDP loss in West Africa of 12.1%, and 11,000 deaths. For anthrax, prior casualties that happened. So these are predicting future casualties. So projected casualties would be 54,000 if you gathered like a sample of anthrax and released it to 100,000 population. 54,000 would be expected to undergo some sort of severe impact. And so basically, I've aggregated all of those and calculated a min and max estimate and used these raw scores to basically put them into the economic aspect of my chart. And then for psychological considerations, So this part was hard to get a more quantitative assessment because there's no quantitative data on how like psychologically impacted an individual or community would be. So I relied mainly on surveys and primary resources like interviews with people and even some videos that I've seen online, like CNN podcasts about the Ebola in West Africa. I viewed those, and then based on that, you can calculate like a sort of scaling. And so I've actually scaled my psychological damage index on a scale of 1 to 10. And so basically, these are from the primary sources, secondary sources, and news reels that I can gather, as well as Census Bureau surveys from WHO, NIH. And based on like the reports that I've read, I tried to scale that accordingly comparatively among these 5 different security events. And so we see that actually nuclear war had the highest average impact, so 9 out of 10. Well, actually 9/11, a type of attack, based on the surveys and articles, had the second highest at 7.5 average, while something like cyber was more variable because maybe it was very easy to obtain some information which caused a lot of economic damage, but not necessarily very psychologically impacting. And so using these data, you can basically put each of these 5 into that matrix that I described in the beginning. And so why are these matrices very useful? So the main purpose is that it provides a very visual tool to compare terror threats on a very simple platform. And so we saw these two. There can be obviously, I think, a wide set of these matrices would be very important. But for now, we've seen 2, which are the ease of obtainment versus the casualty cost. And so from that we could see that it's the more costly weapons actually cause the most damage. And then from the second matrix, we can see that bioterror weapons are less costly, but they actually have a higher economic cost. And that was interesting comparatively to cyber, nuclear, and 9/11 type attack. And I guess for the future, using these graphs, even policymakers can evaluate ways to shift these threats. So if we go back to this slide, imagine if we visualize the current data. So if you create a plan for the next 10 years, maybe you can shift these 9/11 type attacks, create some protocol so that these 9/11